This is Final Fantasy II, but it's actually Final Fantasy II. If you played Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, that is not Final Fantasy II. Released only in Japan in late 1988, the real Final Fantasy II caused many internet confusions years later when video footage got passed around. So, let's start with a very brief history lesson. Final Fantasy launched in Japan in 1987, but wasn't released elsewhere until 1990. Final Fantasy II released in 1991 in the US on the next console, the SNES. Makes sense so far, right? Well, Japan was already on to Final Fantasy IV in 1991, and Final Fantasy II and III for the NES never made it around the world. As such, the official cartridges are all in Japanese and never received official translations. I think we'd all like to thank Square for all the confusion about which game is the real Final Fantasy II or III. While the world did get English translations of Final Fantasy II in 2003, this was in a remade game, and I like to dive into original versions. Yeah, even with this game. Everyone who knew said it would be a mistake. Various fan translations have been made over the years, and my chosen translation was by Chaos Rush, basing the translation around the official ones where possible. And yes, I'm afraid you are seeing emulator gameplay, but let's get on to that gameplay finally. We hear a familiar tune as the new story preview fades in line by line, and then we get to name 4 characters just like before. The only customization is naming with no options for what kind of character you'll have at the start, but we do get some more fully developed profiles to see of our characters. And this time we've also upgraded to a whopping 6-letter limit to name them, improving on only 4. My squad was named Bargle, Benku, Boinda, and Beej. Official translations named the starters Firion, Leon, Maria, and Guy, although still gave the option to rename them if desired. Suddenly, it's battle time. This story begins in a tough showdown. So tough that it seems impossible to win. Your party is getting taken out in one hit and nothing can be done. So that's high drama out of the gate, and it isn't going to slow down. With a much more fully developed story than before, Final Fantasy II promises to be even more thrilling, although it isn't actually a direct sequel to Final Fantasy I. It's just a very similar game reusing plenty of sprites. The new story starts quite dark and gets darker, mostly due to all the deaths that have happened and will happen. The starting 4 have fled their home after losing their parents, but were rescued by the remaining rebels. Except the rebels didn't see Benku, presumably more death right away. After the remaining 3 talk with Princess Hilda, who made an effort to rescue them, they attempt to go back to their hometown of Fynn to speak with one remaining rebel soldier. The first step into the big world of Final Fantasy II shows us another nice green landscape surrounded by plenty of water, but the music isn't at all cheerful. It makes the world seem so desolate with little to no hope left. It's very well done, perfectly using the limited sound offered by the NES. Sometimes an airship will fly by the first town, jolting as if it's going to crash and burn at any moment. An environment very well set up, once again promising a more captivating adventure. Of course, walking around this world will bring back a familiar challenge in randomly encountering monsters that cannot be seen until you are pulled into a battle. The battle scene has been upgraded, where monsters and party members no longer appear to be boxed in separately, leaving room for a big battlefield. It's all still a random turn-based system, but there are some new minor rules in place. The biggest rule change is that melee attacks can now only target the front 2 rows of enemies, with tougher enemies often hiding at the back. The starting characters are all equipped with weapons and armor by default, and can level up their weapon skills individually. The weapons provided are a sword, bow, and axe, and since bow user Boinda started as the weakest, I chose to have her learn magic spells as well. But then I also decided to take away her bow and have her just use her fists to beat up enemies for fun. While it seemed that there wasn't enough customization for the characters at the very beginning, customization is really encouraged by the game once you get into battle. Instead of giving you different character classes, you can now more or less give each character whatever you want. Everyone starts with limited magic points and therefore can learn spells. You can also give any character any weapon, as each weapon skill is leveled up individually. This system was a massive overhaul compared with Final Fantasy I, which had an experience-based level-up system, upgrading skills at random. What Final Fantasy II essentially does is add experience to a skill every time it is used. So if you swing your sword 3 times in a fight, that character will be 3 steps closer to leveling up their sword skill. Taking damage with a character is how their stamina and HP will be increased. This game added the ability to attack your own party, so this can be abused in order to increase HP in a more timely manner. The walk back to Fynn will likely have several encounters with weak monsters like goblins and hornets. Once Fynn is reached, monsters can still appear in the town, which is unusual, but sets the scene for how unsafe it is. Soldiers are patrolling all over town, and talking to one will start a battle, and likely cause a game over. Brutal. After successfully locating the rebel Prince Scott, you'll get an item to bring back to Hilda, and also can bring the news that Scott died from his injuries right in front of you. Hilda will send you on another rescue mission of sorts, but will send a powerful magic rebel Minwu to go with you, adding a fourth character back to the party. A complaint I had about Final Fantasy I was that it took a while to properly begin due to a bunch of fetch quests, but here we were able to get straight to business. Here's Final Fantasy II now also promising to improve on the pacing without having to drop any content. Unfortunately, the pacing of Final Fantasy II on the NES is absolutely terrible. Yeah, I can't sugarcoat it any longer. There isn't much that Final Fantasy II does right. I should have maybe listened to those who said to avoid the original NES version like the plague. I had already played the Pixel remaster of it, and it wasn't anything special, but it wasn't awful to get through. As you might be able to tell, the NES original is awful to get through. Grinding levels was for some reason seen as an important part of early RPGs, which I disagree with from the start, but regardless, this is just the worst. I can deal with grinding for just a few general level ups, but having to level up every skill individually on each character in order to have a chance of progressing makes it feel as if the game is there just to waste your time. The story is one of the strongest parts of the game, despite its love of using death as a plot point, and even that feels disjointed thanks to the need for grinding in between every major plot point. It also makes the story overstay its welcome somewhat, although I did feel this way even without the grinding while playing the Pixel remaster. Now on top of all that, speaking at least for the NES version, the game suggests that you can customize your characters in any way you like, but ultimately the game is lying to you. Not because it's broken or anything like that, but here's what I tried to do. I did almost an hour of grinding right off the bat, and it negated the need for more for a little while, since everyone improved their attack and defense. It also gave me a chance to buy a spell, and I decided that Boina would be my spellcaster. Like, my only one. Final Fantasy II isn't set up for you to only have one though, and at the start of the game spells are quite expensive, so it threw me off the idea that I might need to give everyone spells. Using black magic spells isn't nearly as fun as it was before, as the animations are toned down. Also, you should absolutely load everyone up with spells, and then level them all up. It'll only take 11 years. Magic became the only realistic way to deal with damage taken from battle. Whether it was recovering HP or removing status ailments, potions could no longer be relied on, because of a bizarre limitation not present in the first game. The party's inventory is a key part of the game, and you can stock up on items to help with healing, but this one screen is all you have. Where is the item stacking? Why can't duplicate items be lumped together like they were before? As the game goes on, you'll discover key items that are only used once, but can't be removed from your inventory, so they just take up more and more space. Furthermore, enemies love to leave lasting effects on you, and there are a few different healing potions you'll want to remove the effects after battles. But again, you can't stack duplicate items, so your limited selection probably won't be enough. There is a status healing spell, later known as Isuna, but in order to cure the most dangerous effect, Stone, the spell needs to be at least level 5. So cast it over and over and over. This dungeon design is also some of the worst I have ever seen. I was constantly in shock at how badly wrong it went compared with the lovely Final Fantasy I. The story created some cool dungeon ideas for sure, but all of them are horrendously executed. The floors of each dungeon are often quite small, and I do appreciate that, even though it can't save you from the design at large. You'll be faced with a choice of paths every 3 seconds because this game just loves dead ends. It's not interesting at all. Some of these dead ends will have items to fill up your already limited inventory space, and not enough of them are worth it. Some of these dead ends for items last for several floors, so you won't even know you're not progressing the game for minutes, wasting more time on a bunch of boring battles along the way. None of those items were worth it. Then you have all of these doors scattered around dungeons, leading to completely empty rooms with incredibly high monster encounter rates. The first dungeon of the game shows this off aptly by forcing you to pick between a few doors to be able to progress. Ultimately, this led me to using online maps of each dungeon, because in the back half of the game, I was completely fed up with all of this. So, a moment ago I called the battles boring. Am I just not an RPG fan? No, that's not it. I love even the NES version of Final Fantasy I. These battles are especially boring. I can't even give a good reason why because I don't know how it was messed up when comparing with Final Fantasy 1 and 2, but I just felt so bored by so many of these battles. The first half is fine, but it's mostly in the second half when the battles become less interesting. Enemies love to cast an elemental spell on the entire party which will take its time, and while appearing threatening, in almost every case it isn't fatal. The way the battles are laid out in the overworld is also just peculiar. Much of the first half of the game contains monsters which are never even dangerous from the beginning. The dungeons have more interesting monsters, but on the outside you'll be stuck fighting the weakest monsters far too often. By fighting through them, you could ever so slightly level up your skills in the process, but even if you run from them, it feels like more time wasting. Once again, the story feels disjointed due to the pacing of the game, as in between every dungeon, the party typically returns to Princess Hilda and the rebels to get their next quest. Every time you have to travel the overworld back to their base, more weak monsters get in your way. It isn't until after clearing out the Mysidian Tower about 75% of the way through the game that the overworld enemies become significantly more challenging. I would say finally, but a lot of the stronger enemies are ridiculous. Ouch, this game really is a bad one, and I'm harsh enough to the good games. Let's take a moment to acknowledge some more actual highlights, because it's not the worst game ever made. Nobuo Uematsu was once again back for a masterclass in soundtracks. It was still limited in the number of unique songs, because NES cartridge space hadn't yet been solved. Even so, there was now boss battle music, which, while used inconsistently, was one of the strongest pieces in the game and suited the final fight excellently. Another new thing done in this game was a rotation of guest characters fighting with the party. This is a neat idea since Binku is missing from the party from the beginning, and it also means that there are occasions when you only have 3 characters to fight with. This allows the player to experience useful characters Minwu, a powerful mage rebel ally, and Joseph, who is impressively strong without a weapon. Unfortunately, the other guest characters are inappropriately weak and largely unequipped. Here I go complaining again. The remaining guest characters are almost always at risk of falling in battle when they first join the party, and it takes a while for them to feel useful. Prince Gordon almost never felt useful. Layla the Pirate was probably my favorite guest character, but her uses were very situational. Ricard the Dragoon was a cool discovery for the story, but somewhat boring to use. 3 of these characters also end up sacrificing themselves in the story to save the main party members, and it loses its impact quickly. I don't even understand why Ricard's sacrifice was needed to save the others, but there had to be room for one final guest. Time to quickly summarize some silly second half flaws so I can get to the end. The rebels take back the town of Fynn and its castle successfully, and then the heroes set off for ultimate magic. We have the series' first appearance of Mysidia, the Mage Town, and there are 2 long caves that I would completely remove from the game because they don't add anything to the story. Ultimate Magic is acquired at the top of the Mysidian Tower, which is a very long quest. The Ultima spell is ultimately not very useful, so that basically renders the entire Mysidia plot redundant. After this, an Empire-controlled cyclone systematically demolishes some early game towns, and I don't understand why Fynn wasn't attacked first. The Empire knows the rebels took back Fynn. The main 3 heroes, along with Ricard, go into the cyclone to take down the Emperor himself, and they win. Except out of nowhere, Binku declares himself the Emperor. Turns out he was a Dark Knight all along. Now of course, we have to go through another insignificant dungeon to get to him, but at the end of it, there's no fight. The real Emperor returns from hell because JRPG, declaring Binku a fool to take his place. That's why Ricard sacrifices himself for the others to escape on his wyvern with Binku. Binku's reintroduction to the party doesn't feel natural at all, and I felt no attachment to this character that I had named at the very beginning. Fortunately, he is useful immediately in battles, even though he might be quickly wiped out. With the original 4 back together and the Emperor back and more powerful, there is only one thing left to do: go to hell. A Mysidian mage says there is a nearby cave called the Jade Passage, which connects to hell, and will get the party into the newly revealed Castle Pandemonium. This final dungeon is 6 floors of a cave followed by 10 floors of a castle, with the most brutal monsters and no chances to save. Final Fantasy II allows the players to save anywhere in the overworld, but not in towns or dungeons. 16 floors without saving in this game is ludicrous, but if you can get through all of it, you'll face the Emperor in his new form. There's one weapon you will find early on that looks absolutely useless, as it is statistically the weakest sword in the game, but I hope you kept it for this moment. The Blood Sword's gimmick is that each hit will take 1/16 of the targeted enemy's health, and leveling up the sword skill increases the chance to land multiple hits in one attack. This allowed me to, fortunately, easily finish off the Emperor in only 4 turns, and that was the game. I can't deny that I felt a large sense of accomplishment upon beating the game. It definitely took an overwhelming amount of patience and resilience. However, the end of the story didn't add anything. The party simply says, "Let's get out of here," after defeating the Emperor, and then they somehow do. After that, there's just a lengthy scene in Finn Castle with all the remaining living characters, and it all just feels awkward and unnecessary. Awkward and unnecessary is my evaluation for a lot of the game, too. Therefore, my final score for Final Fantasy II will be 4.8 out of 10. If, for some reason after watching this review, you absolutely have to try the NES version of Final Fantasy II, allow me to recommend that you just save state between every fight, and not during the fights. It simply isn't worth your time to tackle it as intended. As such, you can also speed up the grind for your main 3 by continually selecting and then deselecting attacks and spells, which registers them as being used even if they aren't seen. Brilliantly made code right there. There are slightly less painful remakes of the game on PS1, PSP, and GBA, and of course the most recent Pixel remaster, which was fine, but none of them can truly make Final Fantasy II interesting. Tell me, did you agree with the points I've made? What rating would you give Final Fantasy II for the NES, initially released in 1988? I noticed that as these videos get attention, most of my viewers aren't subscribed, so if you've made it this far, I hope you'll consider subscribing to see more as well as liking the video. As ever, thank you for watching, and please continue to be your own unique self. We truly live in an economy